I had a craving for something sweet. Then I remembered cotton candy exists, which made me wonder how they become so fluffy. Yep, here we go. If you've ever bought cotton candy, then chances are you bought it from a stand, which means you saw that stand owner stick a stick inside a spinny thing and cotton candy wrapped itself around it, seemingly manifesting itself out of nothing. But turns out that was just spinning sugar at high speeds to create fine strands that resemble that ever so fluffy candy. Cotton candy is basically just pure sugar, which as you can imagine is really unhealthy and would probably make your dentist gas you with some nitrous oxide and wire your mouth shut. Speaking of which, did you know that cotton candy was actually invented in 1897 by a dentist named William Moriso and some other bloke? Hey, editing me, insert that one meme about becoming the very thing you swear to destroy. Anyways, the pure sugar is what allows it to essentially just melt in your mouth. Everything else in the cotton candy is just air. Now, for making cotton candy, you'll obviously use sugar because candy. Technically, any type of sugar works, but for practicality, granulated sugar is what you need. Its versatility is what makes it ideal for cotton candy. Granulated sugar is refined and purified into grain form as implied by the name, which creates the perfect crystal texture and sizes for cotton candy making, allowing it to melt quickly and evenly. Purified means no impurities too, which is what prevents uneven clumping. In theory, other sugars could work, but the process is just going to suck. I mean, you're free to try it out if you want. Just don't say I didn't warn you when you're scraping sugar blotches off your kitchen walls. Just stick with granulated sugar. Other sugars won't play nice with your gluttonous goals. Anyways, granulated sugar is what you need, and you can mix it with whatever flavoring or food coloring, which you usually pour into the center of the machine. Now, for the mechanisms and, I guess, science behind cotton candy, the first of which would be melting point, obviously for melting the sugar. Sugar's melting point is around 367 Fahrenheit or 186 degrees Celsius, which of course liquidizes the sugar. But here's the fun part. Sugar is a strange material, so it starts to caramelize after reaching a certain temperature where it goes through a complete chemical transformation. It's almost alchemic in a way, like a transmutation. Now, I'm not going to bother getting myself involved in the argument as to whether it's caramel or caramel, so I'll just alternate between the two, that way you can't complain. Now, you don't want caramelization because it changes sugar into caramel, which results in a completely different taste. Caramelization usually begins at around 160 degrees Celsius, which might seem odd to you since it's lower than the melting point of sugar. But at 160 degrees Celsius, the caramelization process is slow and takes a few minutes before it becomes a noticeable amount of caramelization. The rate of caramelization depends on temperature, so at around 190 degrees Celsius, significant caramelization happens in a matter of seconds. And the recommended heat setting for cotton candy machines is supposedly 150 to 190 degrees Celsius, which falls right into the caramelization range, which just adds on to the strangeness. I'm actually not quite sure why this is the recommended temperature range. I mean, obviously it's for melting the sugar, but if I were to guess, it's probably due to the centrifugal force keeping the liquid moving at high velocities. Just like how it's harder to freeze flowing water, it's harder to heat a flowing liquid, I suppose. I can't remember if that's a legitimate scientific principle. Maybe I'm just making shit up. But anyways, the more sound reasoning would be the speed at which the cotton candy making process occurs at. You know what? I think it might be easier and less convoluted to just describe the whole process at once. To begin the cotton candy making process, you add granulated sugar since most machines are designed to handle them. There are some machines that are designed to handle other types of sugar, but granulated is the most common due to its properties. As the sugar gets added into the machine, the uses of granulated sugar makes it so that the small grains of sugar allow for almost instantaneous melting once they enter the machine. And next comes the most important component of cotton candy making, which would be turning the sweet liquidy goodness into those fine strands of fluff that rolls together to make cotton candy. And cotton candy machines usually achieve those fine strands of fluff by using centrifugal force. The whole machine is basically just a big centrifuge. With the heat melting the sugar into molten liquid, the centrifuge spins and accelerates the molten sugar at usually around 3,000 to 5,000 rotations per minute. And the walls of the centrifuge are lined with small holes scattered evenly around the drum. Once the molten liquid achieves enough speed, it gets ejected through those holes with quite a lot of force. The holes limit the amount of liquid ejected at once. So as the strand of molten liquid flies through the air, it's a small enough quantity to rapidly cool mid-air and form into that fluffy strand before landing on the collection area. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. We'll get into the specifics later. But for now, you've learned the basic mechanics behind making cotton candy. So now you can make it yourself without a cotton candy machine. Kinda. Sorta, not really. You've probably realized by now that as a human, it's impossible for you to achieve all this using your hands alone. All you can do is mimic the process. Making cotton candy requires so much fine-tuning done by the machines that doing it without a machine is going to require patience that nobody has. To put it bluntly, it's not worth the effort. You gotta mix corn syrup, water, sugar, then heat it up in a saucepan or something and stir it until the sugar dissolves. And then you grab a whisk, a fork, or anything with multiple prongs, then flick it around over some parchment paper or something, and voila, you create some strands of candy. Of course, the strands are going to be lumpy and really uneven, but hey, the end result of all that work is something that's clumpy and tastes like shit compared to a real cotton candy. It's simply not worth the time and effort, and chances are you're gonna burn yourself flicking around scalding hot syrups just so you can make some half-baked cotton candy. You'd be lucky to get something that even resembles fluffy strands of cotton instead of something like strings of sinew. In short, and I can't emphasize this enough, just don't try to make cotton candy yourself without a machine. Or buy a machine if you're going to be constantly eating cotton candy. Financially speaking, however, you probably shouldn't buy a machine, since no matter how much you try to justify the purchase by saying stuff like, if I make 400 cotton candies, then I'll get my money's worth. In what world are you going to eat 400 cotton candies by yourself without suffering from high blood sugar or tooth decay? I mean, sure, you could set up a cotton candy stand, but that requires a license, which you can probably bypass using a loophole where you sell something that doesn't need a license to sell, and give the cotton candies as a buy one get a free cotton candy deal. I don't know the legalities of this, so you probably shouldn't completely believe me on this, but yeah, don't buy a machine. If you want cotton candy, just buy some for like $2, or better yet, just don't buy any. What was I saying again? Homemade, tastes like crap, not fluffy. Ah yes, we're going to talk about ways to maximize the fluffiness of cotton candy. Because let's be honest, cotton candy is essentially just 100% pure sugar. If that's how we want it, then we just grab a fistful of sugar and shove it in our mouths. And there you go, there's your sugar intake. But I doubt that anyone eats cotton candy for just the sugary sweetness. I'm fairly certain we eat it for the sheer fluffiness of it all. After all, it's the closest things mere mortals like us can come to eating clouds. Of course, that's not how clouds actually work, but trivialities. Also, I'm probably going to end up repeating myself, so there's that too. Now let's continue. Heat control is an important part of the process. And dry heat allows you to maintain an even and consistent temperature around the previously stated temperatures to keep the sugar at the ideal molten state without burning, caramelizing, or recrystallizing it prematurely before it leaves the drum. And more on caramelization. Caramelization starts to speed up by a noticeable amount after 180 degrees Celsius, going from a few minutes to a few seconds. So one strategy is to keep the temperature just under that. Of course, with how instantaneously the sugar melts upon entering the machine, it doesn't have enough time to caramelize. Another thing is that viscosity changes as the sugar melts. If it's too viscous, then it won't spin properly, and if it's too thin, it might evaporate too quickly to form into strands, which means heating the sugar to the right viscosity is essential for optimal strand formation, which then brings us to the centrifuging process. Another important factor in melting the sugar before significant caramelization occurs lies in the high speeds generated by the centrifuge, which makes it so that the sugar doesn't stay in contact with the heat source for long. A high RPM means thinner and finer strands. The centrifugal force also stretches the molten sugar more when they exit the hull, or in other words, it becomes more ropey when it ejects, which increases the surface area of the strand, allowing for more air exposure, which equals faster heat dissipation through the sugar strands, creating the cloud-like texture along with more consistent strand formation, preventing the sugar from clumping back together before it cools. A lower RPM can lead to thicker strands that don't cool properly, creating bulkier and clumpier sugar threads, which are harder to weave into the cotton candy shape. At higher RPMs, there is also a chance that the frictional heat generated is enough to mess with the temperature. And of course, machines tend to get wobbly if you start pushing them to spin at RPMs they can't handle, which leads to instability. So you need a motor strong enough to maintain a consistent speed without instability. Uneven sugar distribution is another factor. The RPM could be too high and force not fully melted sugar out the holes. 3000 RPM is a nice baseline to start with. And if that doesn't work, then you can just increase the RPM from there. Thicker and inconsistent strands mean you should probably increase the RPM, while for clumping or uneven sugar distribution you should probably lower the RPM, or just increasing the temperature. For the most optimal strands of fluff, you'll need smaller holes to eject the melted sugar through. The smaller, the fluffier it is. Of course, if you make the holes too small, you run the risk of crystallization blockage building up. Ideally, you'll want holes 0.5 to 1 millimeter wide, which, look at this ruler. This is a millimeter. Go grab an actual ruler if you want a better idea of just how big millimeters are. Or better yet, use the American unit of measurement. A house ant is about 1.5 millimeters, so if you're lacking in a ruler, then just abduct a house ant and split it in half to get a measurement about less than 1 millimeter. You also want the holes to be smooth without any rough edges so the liquid doesn't get caught in any crevices, preventing accidental buildup of sugar. Which also means you can't just friggin' MacGyver it by punching a fist-sized hole through whatever material you'll be using for the spinner. If you do that, you'll just have created a goddamn molten sugar blaster. I mean, if you want to weaponize a cotton candy machine, then sure, you can do that. As for determining the ideal hole size, the best way would be through trial and error. But that's a highly inconvenient process since it's not like you're slowly making the hole bigger, where you can just carve a bigger hole. Making a smaller hole means patching in empty space, and you can't just apply plaster or anything like that to narrow the holes. You're just gonna poison yourself with particulate matter and stuff. Now, since the basis of forming strands of cotton candy is essentially just forcing molten sugar through a small hole at high velocities, you can achieve it without the use of centrifugal force. But centrifugal force is the most accessible option since it's quite easy to make things spin in circles. But anyways, once you force the molten sugar through the hole, the area it flies through needs to have proper cooling, which is pretty much already done by everything else, and we already went over that. But to add on to that, a rapid cooling needs airflow to enhance the cooling, so maybe just add some fans or something. But don't add too many or else you'll end up with a sugary mess. I don't think you need to add fans anyways, since most cotton candy machines have a collection chamber that's usually open-aired, which allows for proper airflow, therefore providing sufficient cooling. The airflow also helps guide the strands away from the central heating source and towards the walls of the drum. Faster cooling prevents clumping. If it cools too slowly, the momentum from the ejection won't be able to maintain the shape of the stream, and it will start collapsing or folding in on itself, which creates undesired clumps in your strand. Anyway, all this allows you to preserve the fluffy structure and maximize the fluffiness of it all. To sum it up, making cotton candy requires a lot of speed. How quickly everything happens is what prevents caramelization from happening. Sugar goes in, melts, spins around for a few seconds, shoots out, cools midair, lands on the walls, spin a stick to collect it, and then there you go, cotton candy. Or, just strategically place the exit holes to direct the stream of strands and collect them into a bag or something. I just thought of something. You can really screw with someone if you use something other than sugar to make something abominable. Like salt. But salt's melting point is like 1474 Fahrenheit. That's a pretty dangerous temperature to work with. Maybe find something with a similar melting point viscosity and cooling temperature as sugar. But that's still gonna require a lot of material science, as you try to figure out the ratios of mixtures to get the right viscosity or achieving the conditions to heat and cool it. Man, that's annoying. God, why is everything so complicated? Then again, I'm to blame for wanting to go into so much detail. I guess it also shows that we kind of take things for granted without understanding the process itself. The machine pretty much does all the complicated work for you. All you really have to do is dump some sugar in and then stick a stick in. And only now am I realizing how pointless making this video is. I mean, knowing all this is useless if you don't own a machine. I mean, you could build one yourself, but that would require you to learn quite a lot of engineering. Then again, I guess that's like 99% of YouTube anyways. Just a bunch of useless stuff. Speaking of which, that's a fun project right there. Building your own cotton candy machine. I would love to provide a physical demonstration. But seeing as how I live in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, and that I have no money at all, I can't realistically try building a cotton candy maker. Who knows, maybe 2 to 3 years down the road, I'll have enough money to mess around with a cotton candy machine and have a physical demonstration. But for now, I haven't learned nearly enough about engineering to construct a machine. You'll have to do with this lackluster verbal description of the process. But hey, shorter video. Which maybe means I'm getting better at organization.